The wind came knife-cold off the cirque, combing the meadow grass flat and hissing along the shale like it had a message from the far peaks. Katrin Morel tightened the chin strap of her sweat-dark hat and touched the withers of her mare, Proverb, feeling the animal's breath fog against her knee. The sky had the bright, pitiless blue of high country, and the world smelled of iron and sun-baked pine, a clean scent that made the back of her throat ache with the kind of hunger that wasn't for food. She hadn't come up from the valley for views. She'd come chasing a whisper, old men in town, whiskey loose, talking about a cart track that led nowhere, about timbers sited where no timber stood, about a mine that never shipped or yet fed fortunes. She'd come because somewhere above the tree line, a secret lay bricked into the bones of the mountain, and if she could pry it out, it might finally set her family's name right. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. Katrin eased Proverb forward, the mare's shoes clicking steady across angled slate. The track was thin as thread and mean as a lie, cut across the slope like someone had penciled a scar onto the mountain and dared any fool to follow it. Katrin had always been the sort of fool who kept her own counsel, and the mountain didn't scare her half as much as men with property lines and smiles too quick. Her father's survey stakes still lived in her memory, thin white laths stamped Morel in blue ink, hammered into creek banks 20 years ago when he'd mapped the watershed for the county. Then the railroad had come through with their surveyors, and lines redrew themselves in the night like snakes molting skin. One morning a dam broke, the valley flooded, and the men who should have hung for it went hunting, instead, for scapegoats. The Morel name took the bullet. Her father stopped singing. He died measuring distances no one wanted to know anymore. Those same men built churches with bells the color of money. So Katrin had followed a thread only she seemed to see, receipts that didn't tally in the courthouse ledger, broken spur tracks through willows, a ghost on a topo map. She'd traded the plow for a saddle and the soft dirt of the lowlands for scree that chewed horseflesh. She'd cut her hair to the jaw and tied it off with rawhide, not to pass as any man, but to mean what she said when she told herself she'd be no one's ornament. The track broke across a runoff gully and climbed into crumholes, those twisted, stubborn pines that learned the shape of wind and held it forever. Katrin dismounted to lead Proverb through. Shadows pooled cold between the roots. She could hear water under stone, a hollow trickle like someone whispering through a cupped hand. The sound tugged at a place in her that remembered the river before it went mad with silt. A jay scolded. A marmot peeped. Somewhere above, iron rasped against iron, faint as a memory. No, that was old sound lodged in the mountain, her mind told her. No mine ran up here. No one worked these heights. But then a smell came down the slope that made her stop, whale oil and black powder and wet wool. Fresh, not fossil. Proverb's ears twitched back and forth, listening. The track widened into a shelf where the mountain had shrugged off a chunk of itself in some old winter. Beyond it, a stand of lodgepole stood oddly uniform. God plants in riddles, men, in rows. Katrin knelt and pressed her palm to the dust. Cart wheels. Not one pass but many. The marks were old enough that rain had softened them, but new enough that sun hadn't taken the edges entirely. Easy, she told Proverb, the mare's skin twitching under flies that weren't there. The horse blew softly and bumped Katrin's shoulder, a question and a reproach. They had a rhythm together that 10 bad winters couldn't break, and the mare's worry slid under Katrin's ribs like a thin blade. Still, the shelf beckoned. And the shelf ended at what she'd come for, a hungry mouth in the mountain, cut square and cribbed in timbers gone black with age. Someone had hung a canvas drop from the header beam, a dull, dun tarp fringed with frost where seepage glazed the edges. The canvas flapped twice and then lay still, like a thing that breathed. Katrin tied Proverb to a stunted pine and put her ear to the dark. The mountain spoke in its old tongue, slow drips, a far-off hiss of unseen wind, maybe a pebble settling where a rat's foot touched it. No human murmur. No ring of pick. She drew a lamp from her saddlebags, a brass thing she'd polished until it showed her face in ripples, and coaxed a wick to life. The light spread itself cautious and thin. Coal dust lay on the lip of the portal, disturbed by boot soles small and certain. Katrin stepped over them as if stepping over a threshold into a church. The air cooled her teeth. Water ticked the roof. The first chamber smelled like struck matches and something else she couldn't name until memory brought the word, lye. For cleaning blood. She eased deeper. The tunnel ran true, only slightly canted left, the timbers tight as a righteous mouth. Whoever cut this drove it like a ledger, no poetry, just totals. Old drill marks ran in pairs along the walls where charges had been set. The high country quartz glittered where the lamp played across it, but no or cart track scored the floor. No rails had ever been laid. A mine without rails is a promise with no road to town. Why drive rock with no way to haul it? Unless what you're hauling is an ore. A shaft branched right and pinched, a left-hand drift yawned wider and coughed back at her with colder air. She turned left. The mountain was a book read by fingers. Here were margins, here a paragraph breaks, here someone underlined anger with iron. She moved steady, lamp before her, spare hand to timber, bare palm to grain so she could feel what her eyes couldn't say. The wood surprised her, no saw marks she recognized from the local mill. These timbers had the clean, narrow teeth of eastern blades. Brought in. Expensive. Secret kept dear. She passed 3 empty powder kegs stacked with their bungholes down. She passed an iron-bound chest with its hasp broken but its lid closed, a blind mouth that lied about its emptiness. She passed a spool of wire on a peg, and next to it, a handbill tacked to the wall with a rusted square nail. She angled the lamp. Morel Hydrographic, her father's stamp, blue even in the lamplight, printed at the bottom corner like a footnote no one bothered erasing. The handbill had been a cutout from one of his survey sheets, a cross-section of the valley, river in blue, proposed dam in red. Someone had circled the red with a coal-smudged thumb and written over it in a hand that thought it was educated, staged the failure after third inflow. Witness placement insured. Katrin's breath went thin. The lamp trembled and threw the shadows into a fight. Witness placement, the phrase rattled the bones of her memory. The day the dam went, a sitting magistrate had been at the river for no reason. He'd signed an emergency order pinning blame on faulty survey lines. That order had wed her family to the gallows pole of gossip forever. They didn't just let it break, she thought. They choreographed it. She took the handbill down and folded it into her coat. The paper was stiff with cold and old damp, it had lived with rock long enough to smell like it. She moved on with a new stillness, a hunter's quiet to her boot fall. The tunnel bent, and a breath of open world found her face, the hint of sap and sky, a gentler cold. There had to be a second entrance. Minds that want to hide have 2 mouths. She followed the cooler draft until the amber of her lamp rose to meet a low door made of planks plain smooth as a banker's desk. A lock hung there, busted by someone who thought crowbars were keys. Beyond it, a chamber opened like a throat that had learned to sing. She stepped inside and set the lamp on a flat of rock. Boxes. 6 of them, crates of the sort used to carry heirloom china, straw poking their mouths, lids set back but not pried completely off. On the wall, a rack held ledgers bound in calfskin, their spines stamped with initials that made her stomach tighten, HM and R. She knew the letters the way a rancher knows a brand burned into flank, Hiram McKenna and Ralston, the consortium that owned the rails, the timber rights, the law. She pulled a ledger free. The leather sang as it bent. Inside, neat columns of sums marched like infantry. Date. Payment. Recipient. Purpose. Some lines had cover words, blasting instead of sabotage, drawdown instead of bleed the valley. Others were bald as a drunk, names of county men next to numbers with 4 figures, a judge's surname next to a phrase that read like a dare, affidavit drafted prior to incident. And there, near the bottom of a page that smelled faintly of oil and egg glue, the name she'd wanted and feared most, Morel, then, in a second column, not paid. Her father had refused their money. Katrin closed her eyes. For a moment she let the mountain hold her up. He died believing God had let him be stained so her mother and she could keep eating bread. He died thinking the world was a ledger that would always balance against him. It wasn't a balance, she thought, it was a theft. She took 3 ledgers and nested them under her coat. She took a handful of loose papers pinned to a clip, a diagram with measurements for charges placed to pop the foundation, maps annotated with little X's where sabotage would hide under the name of maintenance. Each sheet laid out a choreography of ruin. It wasn't greed, she realized, it was calculus. How many lives bought a profit margin? Something shifted in the tunnel behind her. Not rock. A sound like a boot choosing where to put itself. She pinched the lamp wick down until the world went to breath in silhouette. She eased around the door frame and put her back to cold stone. Proverbs snorted faintly beyond the throat of the mine, the sound thread-thin from distance but clear as a bell in Katrin's blood. The mare never spooked at rabbits. She spoke only for storms. Voices came with the draft, thinned by the tunnel, vowels stretched flat by altitude. "Lights out," one said. "Thought I saw it from the shelf." Another voice laughed, dry as sticks. "Rats don't carry brass lamps." A third was younger, eager, shame flashing his bravado. McKenna said the place was tight. He didn't say it had ghosts. Katrin slid the lamp into the chamber and nudged the door half-closed. She stood in the seam of dark that fell behind it. Her fingers found her knife by habit and memory. The blade was a short river of steel she'd kept keen with stones and patience. Her heart beat slow, like hooves crossing packed earth, the way it always did when it had something to do besides beat. The men entered with a light that smelled of tallow. Shadow came before them like vanguard. The first one was big in the way avalanches are big, no hurry, just mass, and the tunnel made his breath sound closer than the rest of him. The lamp shone on his beard and the wet of his lip. He carried a revolver in the certainty of a man who'd used it, not the clumsy, child-bright belief of a boy. "Check the ledger room," he said. "We've got sign." "Sign," the young one said. "Paper dust in the air," the big man answered. "Ledger smell. Like glue and finger grease. Old books sigh when you move them. Don't you hear it?" Katrin did. Once heard, the sound was clear as a creak under ice, a papery exhale where she'd shifted a spine on the rack. She held her own breath in answer. A fourth voice spoke, woven of silk and wire. It lacked the mountains, it smelled of boardrooms. "Don't bruise the crates," it said. "We're taking them down valley tonight." The voice didn't echo the way the others did. It refused to belong to the tunnel. "If anything's missing, you'll answer to more than me." Katrin didn't recognize the man, but she knew his kind. His vowels had been schooled in a city with a harbor. He moved like he expected the room to open its throat for him. He thought winter was an anecdote. The big man stepped into the ledger room and saw the lamp on the rock. "Hello there," he said softly. He lifted the flap on the leather rack and spread it like a curtain with 2 fingers and a caution that came from having chased men into holes before. He stepped through and then paused. She heard the moment his eyes told him there was less book and more emptiness. The scrap of strap under the ledger's absent weight made its little vowel of alarm. Katrin moved. She didn't lunge. She unstitched the seam of dark she'd folded herself into, and the knife did its work like a quiet stitcher, one hand to the man's wrist to blunt the reflex that would bring the gun around, the other to the soft place under the ear where men don't armor because pride guards there. He grunted, surprised more than hurt, and she used his mass like a door, swinging him inwards so that his shoulder took the jam of the ledger room and his revolver barked once into old rock. Then the tunnel became busy with sound. The boy screamed, the silk wire voice cursed, and the third man fired blind the way men do when they feel shame about fear. Stone chipped from the header behind Katrin and spattered the back of her neck with grit. She shoved the big man aside. He'd live, she told herself, and slid across the chamber to kick the lamp to darkness. The wick hissed out, and the tunnel inhaled night. The men shouted. "Where, get a match, you fool." Katrin hugged the rib of rock and moved by touch, fingers counting drill scars as numbers she'd invented as a child. 3 steps, then a bruised knee to mark the turn. The mountain taught her the grammar of blind spaces. She let it speak. She passed the crates by smell alone, the sweetness of paper protected by straw, the greasy vanillin of old leather. A hand swiped the dark not 2 inches from her cheek. She felt the heat of it, the quick hairs along her jaw lifting as if the hand had a storm in it. She ghosted under and heard the boy's breath go high and rabbit fast. She reached the low door and dropped to her belly, worming through with the familiarity of a fox tracing an old route. The tunnel beyond pinched and then widened again, and the air got cleaner, and she let herself breathe. Proverb whickered faintly like the end of a rope thrown to a drowning swimmer. Behind, someone got the lamp lit, and a rectangle of old amber bloomed into life. Boots found the timbers. There, shouted Silkwire. She went. Katrin kicked a wedge of loose rock downhill. It cascaded back toward the ledger room, found the lamp, and smothered it in sparks. The men cursed in the dark, and their cursing drew a smile from her that was all teeth and no joy. She reached the main tunnel and ran bent double, her left hand trailing on timber to count the world. 1, 2, 3. At 5 the shaft branched with a slant floor, at 6 an old powder keg made a waist-high shelf. She found it and used it, lunging up and back into the dark like a fish reversing in a slick chute, and crouched in the side drift while the men thundered past toward the mouth. She could have kept running. She could have gone out into the sharp day and loosed Proverb's knot and rode for the pass and taken the narrow, mean trail that would put her on the far side of the ridge by nightfall. Instead, she flattened in the drift and listened to the men's breath drag like chains. One of them coughed a little wet cough that didn't belong to altitude. The boy laughed again, unsteady and proud of having made noise. The Silkwire voice stayed calm the way men stay calm when they think they own the gun that will end the question. Katrin slid the ledgers tight under her coat, binding them to her like ribs. The paper's weight steadied her. Proof doesn't just weigh, it changes gravity. It bends the floor under a life until a person can't walk the old way without noticing the tilt. She came out of the side drift after they'd gone by, moving in the wake of their air the way a trout sits behind a rock to keep from fighting the full river. She let them lead her to the mouth. There, bright day lay like a promise she wasn't ready to cash. The men stopped in a fan at the threshold, their silhouettes cut black against blue. The big man patted the lintel, as if the mine were a horse whose temper he respected. The boy squinted toward the notch where Proverb stood tied. His mouth made the little O of greed. Nice mare, he said. Katrin's jaw tightened. Men always thought of horses as coin purses with hooves. Leave it, the Silkwire voice said. We didn't come for tack. We came for her, the boy said. His eagerness tucked fear into his armpit like contraband. And for what she's carrying. The big man made a noise that wasn't agreement exactly, but wasn't disagreement either. If she's got what we think, she'll run for the ridge, he said. But she's smart. Might double back. Might try to vanish in the slide country. Not a lot of places to vanish in daylight at altitude, Silkwire said. If she's club clever, she'll wait for dark. If she's mountain clever, the big man answered softly, she'll use the mountain now. Katrin smiled without meaning to. Someone had taught this man to read shadows and slopes. She didn't like him, but she understood him. Do we fire the charge? The boy asked, too fast. Silence rolled outward like a dropped stone into snow. Fire the charge. Katrin knew the word before she knew the reason. She'd seen the cut shelves where dynamite went like pollen into anthers. She slid her hand along the post nearest her hip and found what her skin had half hoped, half dreaded, a thin wire wound like a vine. It ran away from the mouth toward the heart of the mine, just above knee height, tucked into shadow where only a hand might notice. She gently lifted the wire free from its notch. It thrummed faintly, as if telling her the distance to the cap. Not yet, Silkwire said after a breath long enough to make a man think. If she goes to ground in there, we'll smoke her out. But I want the crates first. I promise delivery. I don't miss deadlines. Delivery. Katrin could see the road unspool in her mind, mule cart down the shelf, crate onto sledge, sledge to switchback, switchback to wagon, wagon to night road, the ledgers going to a depot where their truth would be boiled into ash and then into nothing. The proof would vanish back into the mountain's vocabulary, known by no one but rock. The men shouldered into the light one by one and turned their backs to the hole, choosing day over dark because pride likes a sky to strut under. Katrin waited until their footsteps scuffed away on the shelf. She slid her knife under the wire and cut it. The wire made a music so small only people who'd listen for a living could hear it. A whisper of tension released. Somewhere in the deep, a watch stopped and looked up. She stood there long enough for her pulse to climb down from the ledges it had scrambled onto. Then she went to Proverb and laid her forehead against the mare's. The horse breathed into her neck like a benediction. "We have what we came for," she whispered. "We also have a problem that's going to want to be a fire." She eased into the saddle and let Proverb choose footfalls until they were around the first bend and the mine mouth had become a secret again. She turned then, laying the ledgers across the pommel beneath her coat, and watched dust lift from the cart track, 2 men down to the hidden lower entrance to fetch crates, 2 more to the trail, the silk wire man standing still and small as a splinter from here, looking back at the mountain like he was waiting for it to salute. Katrin guided Proverb into the timber and cut an uphill line that put spruce trunks between her and the shelf. The air was tin bright, and the sky held that hard shine mountains were when they pretend to be clean. She heard a pika squeal, its panic breaking the day's grammar. A hawk turned slow over the cirque. The bird's shadow slid across stone and disappeared when it crossed the spill of talus like a secret swallowed. Katrin considered the choices. Run for the pass and hope to outride men who had made running their craft. Hide the ledgers and become a fox with her den dug into detail and lock. Or go downhill and make for town with the truth under her ribs, trusting that daylight and a main street make a kind of armor coward men respect, at least when eyes are on them. None of the choices tasted right. She wanted to lay the ledgers on the church steps and ring the bell until the whole valley roused. She wanted to take the silk wire man by his tailored collar and drag him through flood mud and show him the names of the dead written in river silt. But she'd learned the hard way that truth doesn't shout itself whole. Truth needs a stage and a witness, preferably 1,000 of both. Truth fed to the wrong mouth turns to rumor and dies. A movement to her right cut across her thinking, a branch shivered where wind didn't, and the smell of a man's skin, wool and smoke and sour coffee, came on the small breeze. Katrin slid from the saddle and put her hand on Proverb's muzzle, asking the mare to keep secrets. She belly crawled to the edge of a granite block and peered down. The big man had left the shelf and was cutting their sign, not straight, not loud. He moved like he had been taught by a woman who hated waste. He had a scar that cut one eyebrow into 2 separate thoughts and a hat that had once been better than this job. He knelt and palmed the dust where Proverb had stood, and Katrin felt the intimacy of it like being watched while sleeping. His gaze lifted. He didn't look at her, he looked at the idea of her. His eyes climbed the slope toward her stone, and he squinted as if memory were another sunlight. Then he stood and snapped a twig, clean and quick. The sound drifted up and tapped her eardrum like a knuckle on a door. "Hunter," he said to the trees, as if they'd answer. "I don't want to shoot your horse." Katrin's mouth got dry. She didn't think of the knife. She thought of the ledgers. She thought of her father's careful hand and the way he'd taught her to pace the world at 60 inches to a stride. She thought of the river's first mad day. "You don't want to take her either," she called down, keeping her voice between humor and stone. "She'd put you in the creek for trying." Leaves made moving coin around him when he turned. He didn't bring his gun up, he didn't show his hands, either. He let the idea of his hands do the talking. "Then let's leave the horse out of it," he said. "Leave the guns out of it, too, if we can manage that. You got into a place you shouldn't have, and now you're leaving with things that don't belong to you." "They don't belong to you either," Katrin said. "They belong to every grave in the valley." "Graves don't spend money," he said softly. "Men do. I am used to working for men." "Working for," she said. "Or belonging to." He let the words sit. He looked up into branches the color of old pewter. "You cut the firing wire," he said. "I did." "Smart and kind." "Smart doesn't usually ride with kind." "Men who build dams that fall call kindness weak," she said. "That's how a valley drowns." He sighed, and the sound was human enough to startle her. "Lady, these ledgers won't change anything. They just changed me, she said. That's a beginning. A second man appeared on the shelf, the boy, breath huffing like he'd run uphill with pride in his pockets. She up there? He asked, eager to be first, eager to be right. The big man didn't look back. She is somewhere, he said. And she is not alone. I'm with my horse, Katrin said. And with the dead. Dead don't shoot, the boy said. He brought his revolver up like a shout. The big man reached out and put his palm on the boy's barrel. You'll miss, he said mildly. She won't. The boy's mouth worked like a hooked fish. It closed, then opened on a word too small to be useful. Tell your boss, Katrin called, that if he wants what's in this mountain to vanish, he'll need to hire men who know how to be ghosts. Because all I have to do is live to town. You reckon town's going to welcome you with banners and trumpets? The big man asked. You reckon the men who bought Judges didn't buy Judges' friends? I reckon fear has had a long run, she said. And I reckon it's tired. Down on the shelf, the silk wire man stepped into sight again, his coat wrong for altitude, his boots the kind that got carried through mud by a servant. He held a cane because men like him like something to point with. Ms. Morel, he said, careful with the name, putting respect into it as if it were a lever. I'm relieved to find you calm. I dislike disorder. Katrin didn't answer. The mountain had taught her that not every echo deserved to live. I represent interests aligned with the common good, he said. People depend on us. Rail brings flour. Timber brings roofs. Your father's mistakes endangered both. Say his name, she said. Say it and don't swallow it like a pill that leaves a nasty taste. Asa Morel. He measured the world fair, and you wrote lies with red pencil. Silkwire paused a heartbeat. Asa Morel, he said, and made it sound like a paperweight. If he had cooperated, we could have minimized harm. Instead, he made himself an obstruction. An obstruction to what? She asked. Ruin disguised as progress? He smiled without using his eyes. To inevitability. The valley would drown one way or another. The river wanted out of its bed, we gave it a direction. Consider this your chance to be reasonable, Ms. Morel. Hand me the books. I will ensure your safety down the mountain. I am a man of my word. Ask Mr. Field. He tipped his head toward the big man, who watched Katrin the way old hunters watch weather. Field didn't nod. He didn't shake his head, either. His face said he had learned not to be a man used as an oath. Katrin leaned her cheek against Proverb's neck, feeling the horse's breath move her skin. The world went very quiet. Small noises grew teeth, the cicada in a hot stump, a stone settling in the slide, the cloth sound of a hawk's wing folding. I can come down this hill, she said. Or you can try to come up. But only one of us knows what the mountain doesn't forgive. Silkwire tapped his cane in the dust. Mr. Field, he said without looking at him, 2 men to the south draw. 2 to the north gully. Keep her in the bowl. At dusk we close. If she won't bargain, we make a demonstration. What kind? Field asked. The kind newspapers understand, Silkwire said. Fire. Katrin's hands went cold and then hot. Fire and timber at altitude didn't stop at demonstrations, it turned to sermons and then to hell. The crumholes would burn like oiled hair. The wind would carry it to the ridge where the old forest waited like a choir with dry throats. You set that match, she said, and you won't save your precious crates. You'll light a sign big enough for God to read. Silkwire lifted his eyes to the sky. God likes winners, he said comfortably. I have found that to be true. Field flinched, not with body but with breath. The boy didn't hear the flinch, he only heard the word fire and saw his own face lit by it. Katrin considered the ledger under her coat, the paper's edge against her ribs, a square truth that wanted to become a blade. She considered the wire she had cut deep in the mine. She considered the second entrance in the crates and the way carts groan when they take a corner wrong. Her father had taught her that a counterline is a sentence the earth writes, you can read it if you stop talking. She went quiet and read. The miner's shelf, the old slide chute, the dry gully that had once been a spring. There was a route a mule could take if someone who loved mules planned it. There was also a drop, gray with lichen, where wheels would lose their religion and fall into prayer. If the crates went that way, they'd shatter into testimony. She looked down at Field. "You ever get tired," she asked him, "of hauling other men's sins?" He met her eyes for the first time. There was a long road in them. "I get tired," he said, "of the number of ways men can make a small boy proud of the wrong thing." The boy bristled. "I ain't small," he snapped. "Then show it," Field said gently, still looking up at Katrin. The mountain made a sound then, from deep in its throat. A stone loosened where no man had stepped. A raven barked once, as if laughing where it couldn't be seen. Wind shifted. The silk wire man drew his coat around him the way people do when the air goes suddenly honest. "Dusk," he said. "We close." He turned and strode for the lower notch, his cane biting dust like punctuation. Field watched him go and then looked up at Katrin one more time. "Hunter," he said, and this time the word held a kind of respect. "Don't make me shoot at what you love." Katrin touched the ledgers under her coat. "Don't make me turn paper into fire," she said. She swung into the saddle. Proverb moved like a thought she'd been thinking for years. She didn't run for the pass. She trotted along the contour, staying in the trees, keeping rock under her where she could. Twice she belly slid with the mare's reins looped to her wrist while Proverb found purchase with the kind of faith that looks like stubbornness if you haven't earned it. Once she watched a mule deer lift its head with grass hanging from its mouth and decide, with unusual courtesy, not to bolt. By the time the sun broke and slid toward evening, she had eyes on the lower notch. Two men stood there with their backs to the hole, smoking and pretending they liked the altitude. A third moved between crate and cart like a man who wanted to finish the worst part of his day. The silk wire man stood inside the shadow, counting in his head and thinking, as such men do, that counting is the same as control. Katrin tied Proverb in the shade and belly crawled to a boulder no preacher could have moved with a sermon. She lay on its cold shoulder and watched. Field came down the shelf slow, the way men do when they are making a choice and aren't sure yet which one it is. He stopped at the cart and put his hand on the first crate as if it were a calf he was deciding to brand after all. Then he leaned and set his shoulder under its weight. He didn't look up toward Katrin. He didn't have to. She felt the shape of his choice like a breeze turning in pine. "Careful," Silkwire said from shadow. "That timber is bespoke." "Bespoke," Field said, and the word sounded like a thing he might spit. "You send a bespoke crate down a goat track, you take what the goat gives you." "Then don't drop it," Silkwire said. Field didn't drop it. He shifted it just enough that when the cart moved, its center of gravity would argue with the trail. He stepped back, and for a heartbeat he let his palm rest on the crate, blessing or apology, Katrin couldn't tell which. "Dusk," Silkwire said again, as if naming time gave him power over it. "Light the torches." The boy took his match from his pocket with trembling pride. His hand said he had never lit anything bigger than a hearth. He struck once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th the match licked into yellow life. Wind breathed. Katrin watched it lift a lock of the boy's hair. She watched it put a ripple in the torch's first, stuttering flame. She watched it lean its shoulder into the cart a fraction as Field's earlier nudge began to matter. The mule braced. The cart will kiss the edge of the shelf. The crate shifted with a sound like a book deciding to open. Field looked up then, not at Katrin, but at the mountaintop, as if there were a teacher there who might be proud. The silk wire man stepped forward and lifted his cane, as if a stick could push back physics. The crate slid. It went in silence for the first foot, then with a long, wooden sob, then with truth. Straw spun out like golden entrails. The lid blew and pinwheeled away. Papers flowered up into the last sun like mayflies hatching all at once, the valley's crimes turning into weather. "Catch them," Silkwire screamed, not at men, but at the world, as if Aaron Slope worked for him. The boy grabbed. He snatched 3 pages and lost 10. One sheet plastered itself to his face and made him blind to the fact that the torch he held had leaned into a coil of dry grass at his feet. Field moved like a man who had just remembered which side of a line he was born to stand on. He knocked the torch free with his palm and ground it under heel. Another crate shifted. The mountain took a breath. Katrin stood up behind her stone, the ledgers tight against her ribs, her throat raw with something she didn't have time to call hope. She opened her mouth to shout, at Field, at the boy, at the silk wire man, at the mountain, and then she heard it, the sound behind her that didn't belong to wind or hawk or God. A match had struck against a rock. A flare. The smell of sulfur. She turned. A shadow lifted a bottle with a rag for a tail. The rag burned blue for a heartbeat, then beautiful orange. She took a step and another, the word no climbing her teeth like a hand over hand on a rope, and Proverbs screamed the way horses do when the world changes shape in front of them, and the bottle left the shadow's hand and hung for an impossible year in air, spinning, climbing, choosing. It chose the downdraft. It chose the slope where the crumholes held on with roots like fists. It chose to break not on rock, but on a tangle of deadfall laid down by last winter's wind. And the fire that came out of it wasn't a demonstration at all. And the fire that came out of it wasn't a demonstration at all. It unfurled like an accusation, blue at the bones, orange at the skin, running quick with wind under it. Resin in the crumholes caught and sang with that sweet, terrible pitch that makes even brave things shy. The deadfall whooshed up all at once like a choir finding the note. Katrin didn't think of ledgers or names or sentences that could bury men. She thought of the old forest on the ridge and the way a crown fire eats history. She threw herself downhill and hit the first flames with her coat, beating at them until sparks wrote freckles up her wrists. Heat walked into her lungs and demanded rent. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. Proverb danced against her lead rope, eyes white, nostrils rimmed in flame-colored light. Easy, Katrin croaked, though nothing about the world was that. She dragged the mare sideways into a scrape of stone and looped the rope low where fire couldn't climb it. Then she went back to work the way a woman works when there is no one else to do it, without asking if she should. Below, the lower notch had become a page torn in wind. Papers lifted and slid and clung to rock as if the mountain were reading. The boy stamped at a tongue of grass fire with his hat until Field hauled him back by the collar. Get water, Field barked, the command coming from somewhere older than orders. Wet sacks. Dirt. Don't feed it air. He threw himself into the burn line and smothered the first run with his coat, shoulders bunching. Flames leaned back, insulted, and came again. The silk wire man had retreated just far enough to claim later he had not fled. His cane made small, decisive dots in ash that didn't care. Katrin tore a sapling bough and went at the edge from above, flailing in a rhythm that was all wrists and grit. The flames stuttered where she stole their wind. Smoke wrote itself through her throat with a pen dipped in tar. Hunter, Field grunted, not looking up, we need a break in the fuel. She read the slope the way her father had taught her, read it for what it wanted to do. Fire wanted the latter, grass to brush, brush to low limbs to crown. She needed a sentence with no verb in it. Cut me a line, she coughed. 2 bodies wide, bare to stone, from that rock to this draw. Field didn't answer with words. He answered with a shovel someone had stashed against the notch. He carved dirt as if it owed him money. The boy, suddenly useful, fetched sacks from the cart and baptized them in the seat by the mine mouth. The sacks hit the edge and hissed. Wind, easily persuaded, changed its mind. Smoke went sideways. A gust shouldered the newborn flame toward the rock line Katrin and Field had raked from duff with their bare hands. For a moment the world crouched, deciding. It decided in their favor. Flame nosed at stone and sulked. The crumholes beyond still whispered its dry prayers, but for now the answer was not yet. Katrin sagged backward, elbows trembling. Somewhere a pine cone popped like a pistol. She tasted blood where the smoke had scoured her mouth. Field wiped his forearm across his eyes and left a black bar there. The silk wire man's voice arrived as if carried by a servant. Satisfied? He asked, and made you fools sit down quietly after it. No, Katrin rasped. I'll be satisfied when Rain writes a different ending. She pointed down to the cliff where papers still drifted and fluttered and the creek snagged them along its edges. And when those pages reach eyes that aren't for sale. Field followed her gesture with his gaze. His mouth made a thin line that could have been grief or decision. We don't have long, he said. Your break will hold in a steady breeze, not in a temper. If you're running those ledgers to town, you run them now. You coming? She asked before she could tell her mouth to be cagey. He glanced over his shoulder toward the silk wire man, who had chosen a rock that didn't dirty his trousers. I was hired to haul crates, Field said, not to light forests. He looked back at Katrin. The line in his mouth softened a fraction. I'm done hauling the wrong thing. The boy heard that. He looked from Field to silk wire and back, hope and fear arm wrestling behind his eyes. What about me? He blurted, trying to make defiance sound like loyalty. You choose, Field told him. Like men do. The boy swallowed. His fingers tightened on his hat until the brim bent. Then he took one faltering step toward the creek where papers collected like white fish, and another. He waded in up to the knee and started plucking pages from the current and slapping them onto rock where the wind couldn't steal them twice. Silkwire stood. You will all regret this, he said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He had been taught that regret follows money like shadow follows noon. Mr. Field, your wages end here. Field smiled without any warmth. I reckon they ended a while back. Katrin tightened Proverb's cinch with hands that shook only after they were done. She slid the ledgers deeper under her coat until their corners pressed her ribs like truths that wanted to become bone. She swung up, breathed once through the smoke, and pointed the mare toward the traverse that would keep her in the trees. Hunter, Field called. She turned. He tossed her a small canvas roll. It landed soft in her palm, cartridges wrapped in oiled cloth. For company on the road. She nodded, felt the weight of the gift, and stowed it where her hand could remember it later. There'll be a reckoning, she told him, and surprised herself with the prayer and the words. There always is, he said. It just don't always show up dressed as law. His gaze ticked to Silkwire. Go. She went. The trail stitched itself along the mountain's hem, in and out of brush, over stone that held heat and stone that hoarded ice in its belly even in July. Katrin kept Proverb to a ground-eating trot where the footing held and a careful walk where angles tried to sweet-talk ankles. Twice she heard men, once on the ridge above, once down in the boulder field, moving like people who think bullets are arguments. She went quiet as snowmelt and let them spend noise on one another. By the time the sun took its hat in its hands and apologized to the world for leaving, the valley had opened below like a book she knew well. There were the patched roofs of town, the dull silver river, the scar where the old dam had failed, now grown over with willow and a kind of sorrow that had decided to be grass. There, too, the rail yard lay like a yoke across the flats, and a locomotive breathed idly, iron lungs doing their evening prayer. She didn't ride straight for Maine. Men who owned ledgers also owned eyes. She cut through the old orchard where the Morel family had once traded apples for nails, and she let Proverb pick a path among trunks that remembered small hands. She dismounted by the back of the livery and slid the ledgers into a grain sack that had once held barley and now held history. The church bell rope hung in a lean-to. She could have pulled it. She could have rung until the whole town came with lanterns and questions. But she pictured Silkwire's smile and the way power prefers rooms with doors and custodians. Bells gather crowds. Crowds gather speeches. Speeches are where truth goes to wear a stranger's coat. Instead, she went to the only press in town that could turn paper into echoes that crossed county lines. The newspaper office sat between the dressmaker and a store that sold notions to people who wanted to change but never did. Its windows held the dull gleam of glass that had learned to keep secrets. Inside, ink smell hugged her like an old aunt who'd never learned gentility. Gears rested with the patience of oxen. A woman looked up from a stick of type and pushed a gray curl behind her ear with a thumbnail black with work. Evening, Katrin, said Mavis bowed. She was thin as a purpose and wore her spectacles on a chain because she had thrown them once in a meeting and didn't want to have to hunt. If you're here about the water meeting minutes, tell the board to write their own lies. Not minutes, Katrin said, and put the grain sack on the table. Its thump traveled through the wood into the floor and up into the bones of the building as if the town itself had felt it. Proof. Mavis didn't bluster, not that she ever had. She pulled the ledger nearest the top and let it fall open to see where it wanted to land. It chose a page with the judge's name. She read without moving her lips, but Katrin could see the words spanking her as they went by. Sweet mother of typesetting, Mavis said softly. She turned pages, faster now, the way people do when they are greedy for cleansing. She stopped at Morel, not paid. Her mouth trembled. She closed the book and set both hands on it like a midwife between contractions. Asa was so sure he'd failed you. He didn't, Katrin said. Her throat closed around the old ache and came back with something new in it, fierce and gold. He wouldn't take their coin. Mavis set her spectacles on her nose with a motion that made the chain click like tiny spurs. All right, she said to herself, as if summoning troops. All right. We're going to set half of this tonight, affidavits, those payments, your father's refusal. We'll run a broadside before dawn and a special edition by noon. We're going to nail these to telephone poles like theses. Before dawn, they'll be writing, Katrin said. Men who don't bother with court. Then we make copies, Mavis said simply. We make so many the world chokes on them. We'll send packets on the midnight train to Denver, Cheyenne, Salt Lake. Editors who hate me will print it just so they can claim my scandal as theirs. She looked up over the top of her glasses. Can you bring me a witness they can't buy? Katrin thought of Field with his black forearm, and the way he said bespoke like a curse. Maybe, she said. And if not, I can bring them a boy who's learning which kind of proud to be. Mavis nodded. A boy will sell papers. A man will keep them sold. She slid the ledger back into the sack and retied the mouth. You keep these on your person until I call for one, and when I do, you hand it to me in public with 100 eyes watching. If a ledger walks out of here by mistake, I want the whole town to trip it. They worked. Katrin's hands learned to sort pages by smell and grain, learned the language of type, EMS and Ns, leading and slug. Mavis's daughters came from the back with coffee and resolute chins. Words bit into paper, reverse and mirror and write again when pressed. Twice, boots thumped the boardwalk outside in a rhythm Katrin's gut didn't like. Twice, Mavis's eldest girl slid the derringer from its drawer and laid it atop the galleys like punctuation. Near midnight, the bell of the locomotive clanged twice, a private signal for men who make their living moving what doesn't want to move. Mavis glanced toward the depot and then at Katrin. We need a courier, she said. Someone honest and stubborn. Field, Katrin said. You trust him? I don't have time to teach someone else the mountain, Katrin answered. Mavis didn't waste a nod. Go. Bring him. I'll wrap the packets. Katrin slipped the ledgers back under her coat. She left by the alley, a shadow among dry barrels and rain pipes. The town had that midnight hush that isn't peace so much as people holding their breath. Far up the mountain, a smear of dark on darker marked smoke that hadn't finished its argument. She took the back way to the livery. Inside, Proverb lifted her head and sighed. Katrin rubbed the mare's forehead and whispered apology and promise both. She saddled by feel and let out by the river, staying in brush where moonlight played tricks with depth. Field wasn't at the mine. She didn't expect him to be. Men who change their lives don't stand still. She found him instead where two roads made a cross and a cottonwood kept the town from forgetting water, sitting on the roots, hat in his hands, like a man who had gone to see whether prayer would answer him and discovered it sometimes does. You're late, he said without reproach. You're hired, she said without ceremony. Courier wages, payable in the faces of men when they see their names in print. He huffed, which might have been a laugh. Where to? Denver first, she said. Then Salt Lake. Then everywhere that prints in black and believes it's white. She slid a packet from her coat, brown paper tied with twine and already tattooed in Mavis's hand. Guard it with everything. Field weighed it in his palm. I hauled ore, wheat, and timber, he said. Never hauled something that kicked like this. His eyes went to the river. There'll be men on the line. There will, she said. But there'll be men on the roads tomorrow, more and worse. Tonight, the night has a way of confusing them. Go now. He tucked the packet inside his shirt, close to the hard wall of his chest. What about you? I've got a bell to ring without touching a rope, Katrin said. He looked at her like he wanted to say something large and settled for something useful. The boy, he said. He took Pages to his aunt's place by the creek. If you need a voice, he's got one. Loud and half-broken. Half-broken voices carry, she said. Like mountains do. Field stepped into the shadow and was gone, absorbed by the town like a nail into old wood. Katrin turned proverb toward the creek. The Morel place had burned to the sill and then been rebuilt in the stingy way people rebuild when grief makes them quiet. The boy and his aunt lived in a cabin with shingles like scales and a porch that wanted to sag but hadn't yet decided to. A lamp burned in the front window with a dish of water set before it, mountain custom against house fire. Katrin rapped on the jamb. The boy opened the door before the second knock. You came, he blurted, pride in it like sugar on scorched fruit. He had ash in his hair and a night's worth of smoke in his lungs. What's your name? Katrin asked. She had been calling him boy in her head because that's how Danger names people who might matter. Jory, he said, as if he wasn't sure he had earned it. You're going to read, she told him. On the church steps. And you're going to do it before men wake. His aunt appeared behind him, a woman with arms that had learned their work from kettles and grief. He'll read, she said, and lifted her chin toward the night. I'll stand with him. They went. There wasn't anything ceremonial about it, no ribbon cutting, no lanterns in a pretty row. Mavis had sent a bell of her own, 2 girls with stacks of broadsides and paste made from flour and fury. Jory took the step like a boy taking the last height on a dare and cleared his throat. He read. The words came raw at first, then steadier, then with a rhythm that wasn't pretty but was honest. Names landed like hammers. Some fell like stones. The crowd that wasn't a crowd yet, that was 3 miners off shift, 2 women with their shawls hugged to their hearts, a one-legged carpenter, and a drunk who had never missed a fire, stood and let the words turn their faces from sleep to morning. By the 5th paragraph, somebody shouted. You calling Judge Pritchard a thief? Jory glanced at Katrin. She didn't move. She let the ledger she held with both hands be the answer. I'm reading what's on the paper, the boy said. If it's lies, it ain't me lying. He read again, louder. Behind him, Mavis's girls started pasting broadsides to every flat surface that would hold, the church door, the telegraph pole, the post office window. Lights began to appear in houses like eyes opening. Rumor wakes like that, but so does truth when it finally gets its boots under it. Feet thumped on stair treads. Doors opened. Men came out in shirt sleeves with their suspenders hanging like undone promises. Women came out ready to fight for the first good thing they'd heard in years. Judge Pritchard himself arrived wrapped in a dressing gown that wanted to be a verdict. He had a face like a pocket watch, smooth until you looked close and saw how the hands trembled with use. What is the meaning of this? He demanded, and made meaning sound like a word you had to borrow from him. He tried to take the paper from Jory's hands. Jory flinched, then set his jaw and held on. The judge's fingers met Morel bone by proxy and decided not to win that contest. It means you're named, Mavis said from the foot of the steps, ink on her cheeks like war paint. She had arrived without Katrin seeing her arrive, the way printers do when paper calls. Sit down and listen like everyone else. I will not, Pritchard said. This is libel. This is sedition. This is accounting, Mavis returned. Libel is when you make up numbers. Voices rose. The kind of crowd that scares good men because it looks too much like a mob began to consider itself. Katrin felt the ledger's weight and moved to stand on the other side of Jory, her presence a fulcrum the men in front hadn't calculated. "Let the boy finish," someone called from the rear. It was the one-legged carpenter. "I ain't heard the end of a story in 3 years without a man like you cutting it off at the middle." Jory finished. He read Asa Morel's refusal in a voice that started to break and then chose not to. He read the notation about the staged failure. He read the names of the dead written in ink and not in river silt at last. Silence followed. Not the kind that happens when people don't know what to say, but the kind that happens when they know too well and are deciding whether to let the knowledge change them. Then the telegraph office door opened with a bang that had nothing to do with wind. The operator waved a strip of paper like a white flag someone had written on. "Wire from the division superintendent," he cried. He looked at Katrin because the town had already decided the wire was for her. She took it. The dots and dashes had been chewed into English by a man who didn't like the taste. Stop sat where periods should, like little fences. Morel stop cease distribution stop return all materials to railroad office stop warrants will be issued stop. Katrin folded the message and put it in her pocket like a dead wasp. She looked at Mavis. Mavis looked at the crowd. "Print faster," Mavis said to her girls. Pritchard found his volume. "Sheriff," he bellowed toward a man whose badge had seen more pie socials than gunfights. "Do your duty." The sheriff swallowed. He had a kind face that had never learned to be hard. He walked up the steps and took his hat off to Jory before turning to Katrin. "Ma'am," he said, "pain already there, I'm going to need those books." "No," Katrin said, "because sometimes the one syllable is the whole speech." "You can't stand against the law," Pritchard snapped. "I'm trying to make one," she answered. "For once." The sheriff's hand hovered, not touching, the way a good man's hand does when it wishes it were elsewhere. "Please." Katrin scanned the faces. She saw her father's apprentices grown old and bent. She saw wives who had learned their husbands' work because a river had taken the men. She saw boys who had never learned to swim and did not trust water anymore. "I'll bring one ledger into the courthouse," she said. "I'll stand on the floor and read it into the record. After that, the crowd can decide what happens to the rest." The judge blanched. "This is public," Mavis said. "You remember public, Your Honor? The people you serve?" The sheriff seized on it like a raft. "All right," he said. "One ledger. All eyes." Then back to the paper office with the others. He looked at Katrin. "I won't let anyone take them from you by trick." "Won't or can't?" Pritchard muttered. "Both," the sheriff said, and for the first time that night, the crowd cheered. They moved as an animal, up the street toward the courthouse whose columns had been shipped from a place that had never seen weather. Katrin walked beside Jory, the ledger pressed to her ribs like a child, Mavis at her heel with a bundle of broadsides under her arm, the sheriff ahead like a man leading a parade he hadn't planned. Pritchard scurried, trying to find someone whose authority outmuscled the moment. On the courthouse steps, Katrin turned. She opened the ledger and let it fall to the page that wanted light. She read. Her voice wasn't pretty. It had gravel and smoke and 10 winters in it. It had her father's fiddle when he thought no one was listening. It had the scrape of survey stakes going into honest ground. Halfway through the page, a whistle screamed. Not the locomotive's bored evening call, this was the yard alarm, yanked by a hand that meant to empty the streets. The crowd flinched and then stiffened. A man in a long coat sprinted up the center of the street with a telegram clamped in his teeth and fear running behind him like a dog. "Train," he shouted when his lungs found arrangement. "Eastbound. 20 minutes early and not stopping. Company cars. Pinkertons." The word hit like shot. People who had never seen a Pinkerton agent had heard what they were, the way rumor travels on hooves. Men hired to end questions. Men who treat law like a club. Mavis didn't blink. "Then we make their arrival a party," she said, and thrust broadsides into hands faster than fear could fill them. "Paste every post. Run the press. Sheriff, you keep the peace with your mouth, not your pistol. Katrin closed the ledger and tied it again under her coat. She looked down the street toward the rail yard where a lamp had come alive in the tower. She felt the town inhale. She felt the mountain watching like a mother who knows which child is about to learn the hard way. She turned to Jory. Go to your aunt, she said. Tell her to keep her door shut and her lamp in water. What about you? He asked, already trying not to cry. I'm going to stand where men can't pretend not to see me, she said. The whistle blew again, nearer now, a long metallic scream dragged like a blade along the night. The rails hummed underfoot. Women pulled shawls tight and then loosened them again, indignation heeding what the air wouldn't. Katrin walked to the center of the tracks where Maine crossed and took her place. Proverb, tied to the hitching rail, stamped once and snorted as if saying you always pick the less sensible thing. The sheriff came and stood at Katrin's elbow. Field stepped out of shadow on the far side of the street, breathless and empty-shirt. He had given the packet to Steel and Steam, and took his place on the other elbow without asking permission from anybody. The engine's eye rounded the curve, a brilliant, pitiless lamp. The pilot cars behind wore black paint-like uniforms. Men stood on the platforms, hats pulled low, coats that didn't wrinkle, hands like pliers. The town didn't run. It gathered. The engine thundered into the crossing and braked hard enough to make Steel cry. Sparks fell like brief stars. The first company car door opened before the wheels had stopped turning. A man in a bowler stepped down with a paper in his hand, uncertainty in his spine. Behind him, two lines of hard men formed like walls that moved. Catcher Morel, the bowler said. He didn't ask, he pronounced. By authority of. Who paid you? Mavis muttered under her breath, and somebody's laugh leaped and then died because this was not exactly funny. You are placed under arrest for theft of property, trespass, arson, and incitement, the bowler finished. He held out the paper like a priest's book. Surrender the materials and come quietly. Katrin looked at the town. Then she looked at the ledgers under her coat. She thought of her father putting a stake in ground and stepping back to see if the world moved around it. You're late, she said. The bowler's eyes flicked to the broadsides pasted to every upright surface in sight. His mouth tightened. You will be searched, he said. Now. Two agents stepped forward. Field shifted his weight. The sheriff's hand went up. This is my town, he said, his voice calm enough to sound like authority. We do things under our roof. He gestured toward the courthouse. Public. Proper. The bowler considered the faces. Pinkertons don't fear mobs, they fear photographs of mobs with names under them. He tipped his hat an inch. Very well. Inside. They moved as if in a procession, the town on both sides like pews. Inside, the courthouse smelled of wax and an old case no one had dusted. Pritchard had planted himself at the bench with a look that said he owned the furniture and therefore the day. Proceed, the bowler said. Katrin stepped to the table and set one ledger on it. She kept the others under her coat because some lessons, even a mountain has to repeat. Search, the bowler ordered his men. An agent reached for the ledger. He never touched it. The courthouse doors blew inward with a crack that must have started on the far end of town. Wind hit paper and sent a handful of broadsides spiraling through the air like pale birds. A second noise layered over the first, a rattle that wasn't train, wasn't thunder, wasn't anything that belonged in a courthouse unless you expected a war. Men dove without being brave. Women pulled children flat with ferocity that would have made a preacher rethink his sermon about meekness. Katrin's body moved before her mind caught up. She threw herself across the ledger, arms making a cage for the book, head down, one eye tilted just enough to see the door. There, framed in the open maw, was a silhouette she knew too well, long coat, hat brim knife straight, a cane that wasn't a cane at all in the way it was held. Behind him, the street ran with men whose faces had been taught not to be faces. The silk wire man had not come alone. And in his other hand, not the cane, not the paper, he held a match that had already been struck. He flicked it casually toward the old velvet curtain behind the bench. The fabric caught with a sound like a whisper turning into a scream. "Lock the doors," Silkwire said, and his voice cut neat as glass through the first lick of flame. "Search them all. Burn whatever you find." The sheriff reached for his pistol and found the bowler's gun already at his head. Mavis's girls snatched up inkwells like stones. Field took a step and then another and then stopped because the first agent had a hand on Jory's shoulder, and a hand with a boy in it is a hostage you can't shoot through. Heat leaned its first curious cheek across Katrin's neck. Smoke hooked a finger in her nostril and tugged. She looked down at the ledger under her hands, the ink, the calfskin, the numbers that had made a dam into a murder, and understood, with that cold clarity the mountain sometimes gives, that paper's first enemy is fire and its second is fear, and in this room she had both. She looked up at Silkwire and saw his smile. He believed in inevitability. He believed the room was his because he had paid rent on it. Katrin reached slowly into her coat, not for the ledger, not for the knife, but for the oiled cloth roll Field had thrown her on the mountain. She felt the cartridges under her fingers and, wrapped alongside them, the small thing she had almost forgotten she owned, a whistle with a split reed, used to call her father back from surveying when the river got proud. She put it to her lips and blew. The sound cut through smoke and command both. It sliced the room into a before and after. Outside, Proverbs screamed once. The courthouse windows went white with sudden light that wasn't fire. An engine, harder and hungrier than the one that had just arrived, roared into town from the west where no track ran. The floor shivered. And then, from beneath their feet, the world began to move. Moving not like an earthquake, not with the long roll belly of the earth, but like a beast waking in the cellar. The floorboards lifted a finger's breadth and settled, lifted and settled, a heartbeat turned into wood. The curtain behind the bench licked higher, heat snatching air the way thieves snatch purses. Smoke crawled across the ceiling seeking a spine to climb. Katrin's whistle note still hung in the rafters. The answer came from below, a second, deeper call, the bellow of a steam donkey taking its first lungful. Somewhere under the courthouse, no, under the alley that ran between the courthouse and the newspaper office, the old logger's engine Mavis kept for power roared to life. Katrin had seen it once, a sprung and scarred thing with a boiler patched like a quilt and a flywheel that could rip shirts from careless men. The press could be driven by foot treadle if you had daughters with calves like iron. But when Mavis wanted to speak loud enough to be heard in other towns, she belted the donkey to the press. Tonight, Katrin hadn't blown the whistle for printing only. Below, belts caught and tightened. The floor took the vibration and passed it along, the benches quivered like nervous horses. The bowler blinked up at the ceiling as dust sifted into his eyes. The agent gripping Jory's shoulder swore and loosened his hold. The sheriff used the inch he got like a man uses a lifetime. "Water," he shouted toward the doorway. "Buckets up. Keep the curtain wet." Women moved first. They always did when fire tried to write endings. They formed a line from the pump on the square to the courtroom, passing tin pails like rosaries, hand to hand, steady, not fast. Fast breaks things. The first bucket leaped into the air as the floor trembled and still found Jory's aunt's hands. She slung water at velvet, it hissed and sulked, steaming like a snake thwarted of a bite. Mavis's girls appeared with paste pots they refused to abandon even for smoke. One slapped a broadside onto the inner door, the paste smeared under her palm like war paint. It read in big type, "Who profited when the valley drowned?" The silk wire man stepped forward with his matchbox like a bishop with a reliquary. "Calm. Certain." He pointed with his cane. "Lock those doors," he repeated. "Search the woman. Search the press. Seize all copies. This is a federal matter." "Federal?" Mavis coughed. "You couldn't spell federal the day before last." She turned and shouted down through the floor hatch, "Hollis, open the valves." The donkey engine brayed. A jet of steam hissed through a pipe Mavis had hidden in the joists for a day she hoped wouldn't come. The whistle blast wasn't a sound so much as a verdict. It tore out of the courthouse eaves and into the night and bounded off windows and woke dogs that had never heard such a thing. The trainmen on the company cars turned to look by reflex. The town bell answered without rope, rung by the steam line Mavis had rigged in secret because she never trusted men to wake properly. The bowler tried to shout over it. His words went flat as paper. Katrin felt the room's mind change. Panic had been sniffing at the edges. The whistle made panic take 2 steps back and become purpose. She lifted the ledger off the table with her left hand and held it like a shield. With her right, she palmed the cartridges and slid one along her sleeve where it could pretend to be courage if courage failed. Field moved at the same moment she did. He wasn't quick so much as inevitable. He stepped into the agent's reach and twisted the man's wrist with a pressure that said not now. The pistol clattered. Jory scuttled backward like a crab and fetched up against Katrin's skirt. She planted a knee and let him hide behind cloth like boys do when their mothers are dead and someone else volunteers to be weather. Search her, the bowler snapped at a second agent, and the man lunged the way paid men lunge. He found himself checked by a woman's hip and a pail's wooden rim. Jory's aunt had forgotten to be shy 30 years ago. She planted the bucket on the agent's chest and walked him backward in 3 efficient steps until he sat hard in the first row. She poured what was left across the spark-hungry velvet with a little extra for the silk wire man's shoes. "Assault," the bowler squawked. "Assault is a river on a Sunday morning," Jory's aunt said. "This is housekeeping." The sheriff raised his voice again. It came steadier now, the donkey engine's rumble lending it a back. "Deputize on my word," he said, pointing with his hat. "Field." "Mavis." "Jory's aunt." 2 minors. "That carpenter." "Our town's under threat." Arms down, hands open, eyes sharp. "You see a match, you take it. You see a boy, you keep him behind you." "I don't recognize your authority," the bowler said, but even he sounded like a man who knows his keys won't open a particular door. Katrin took 1 step toward silk wire. She stayed inside her body the way she had learned to on the mountain, no further than her breath, no nearer than her bones. She had always believed that distance saves. Tonight was teaching her that closeness can, too. "You can burn this room," she told him. "You can burn this whole block. But you can't burn the sky. And tonight, we rode on sky." He smiled. He had the smile of a man who hides behind other men's willingness to do small crimes for large wages. "You underestimate both physics and price." He tilted his head toward the window where steam still ghosted the panes. "Engines break. Men tire. Fire consumes if you let it. Engines also make paper fly," Mavis said. "And I like the sound of wings." She nodded to the press gang below. The donkey coughed, the flywheel turned, and the floor shook again, more violent, more insistent. The curtain tore under its own soaked weight and dropped in a hiss. Smoke punched, then lifted, losing its anchor. The bowler saw his opening in the blind moment that followed. He surged toward Katrin's coat with a hand like a clamp. Field's forearm intercepted his wrist midair with a sound like a green branch refusing to break. The bowler yelped, dignity leaking out of him in a stream. Field didn't twist further. He just held the man there and let him feel the fact of being stopped. Pinkertons bunched. Townsfolk bunched opposite. It wanted to be a fight. It itched to be one. But the donkey's thrum and the bucket line song and the paced quick hands made it something else, an argument with history, not with flesh. "Out," the sheriff said to the agents. "Out and back to your cars. Or you'll answer to this town." "We answer to a larger map," Silkwire said. "That should be obvious." He lifted his cane and touched the ledger's calfskin with it. "Last chance, Ms. Morell. Hand me what you stole, and you'll not be dragged out in irons." Katrin didn't look at the cane. She looked at his eyes. They were clever and incurious both, the eyes of a man who wins by not learning the names of those he steps on. "I didn't steal what wasn't yours," she said. "I claimed what belonged to the dead. And I'm done asking men like you for permission to speak over your noise." He flicked a glance at the bowler, annoyed at the lack of simple obedience. The bowler, shading his injured wrist, gave the smallest shrug money can make. Then a sound came that didn't belong to any machine in the room. It rose through the boards like water through marsh grass, the crowd outside finding one pitch. Not a chant. Not language. A breath stacked on breath until the courthouse itself seemed to inhale. Mavis's youngest daughter, hair slicked to her skull with sweat, peered up through the floor hatch and grinned a grin with ink on its teeth. "Press is running," she called. "First bundle's ready. Got a boy running to the telegraph with your wire, Sheriff. Denver editor says he's sending a man on the downline to cover." The bowler's face emptied in sections. Silkwire's smile didn't slip. It grew. "All the better," he said. "Spectacle loves a lens." He raised his hand. 3 agents drew as if their pistols had liked being in their coats and resented the dark. Katrin's body knew fear. It didn't let fear lead. She set the ledger down, slid the whistle into her mouth again, and blew not the long call to engines, but a short, sharp bird cry her father had used to talk across ravines without waking cougars. 1 note. Then 2. Then a silence that wasn't empty at all. From the back of the room, from a place no one had looked because Silkwire had drawn all eyes like a coin in a conjurer's hand, another door opened. The carpenter, the one-legged man, had spent a decade building a ramp along that wall to teach himself balance. He had also, apparently, built a latch any child could thwart. He swung the panel and revealed a narrow hall and, in it, 3 men carrying canvas coats and copper nozzles. "Hook and ladder," the sheriff said, relief changing his height. "I forgot you boys drilled Thursdays." "Been a long Thursday," the captain of the volunteer company said cheerfully. "Make a lane." He raised the nozzle and laid a cold vein of water along the room where agents wanted to be brave. Gun hands flinched from the shock of it. Metal complained. "Out," the sheriff said again, not louder, but in a voice that discovered it had always had a wall behind it. One by one, with the sullen reluctance of men who have to wait to be cruel another day, the agents backed toward the door. The bowler went last, nursing his wrist like a rejected proposal. Silkwire did not move. He stood as if he were founded in bedrock. The water mist jeweled his hat brim and clung there like unanswered questions. "You've delayed me," he said to Katrin. "You haven't stopped anything." "You sure?" Mavis asked, and tossed a damp bundle up through the hatch. It popped in the air and split, pages fanning like birds too impatient to wait for hands. On each, Morel not paid in letters tall as a man's lie. Below, the ledger entries. Below those, the names of the drowned and the date. Silkwire took it in. His smile thinned until it was only a line drawn by a man whose pencil's never dull. He tipped his hat. "I'll see you hanged," he said, unnervingly gentle. "Not just for theft. For incitement. For arson at a mine. For treason, if I can frame the word to fit." "You can frame anything," Katrin said. "You're just not going to hang a valley." He turned and walked away through the door his own men had doubtfully reopened for him, his cane ticking time on the threshold like a metronome that could call the dead to heal. When he was gone, the room sagged. Not with defeat, exhaustion has the same posture as triumph from the waist up. People remembered to breathe. Jory remembered to stay upright. The ledger weighed what it had weighed before and more. "Back to the press," Mavis said to her girls. "We don't stop until we're tired twice." "Hunter," Field murmured. He wasn't touching her and still seemed to be holding her up. "He'll come again." "I know," she said. "We'll be here when he does." Morning broke not long after, bringing with it the particular boldness of daylight that makes men look smaller and women look exactly their size. The town had pasted itself in newsprint. The train stood sullen on the siding, its firebox banked as if it had fallen asleep angry. Before afternoon's heat could test the brake line on the mountain, clouds built out of the west with the fast-stitched look of weather decided elsewhere. Fat drops hit the dust like punctuation. Thunder wrote its name across the ridge. The first hard rain in weeks came sideways and then straight and put its hands down on the fire scars and said enough. Katrin rode to the mine with Field at her knee and Jory on the mule behind them, because boys who had stood up in front of judges need to see how stories finish. The shelf bore footprints of men who'd left in disorder. The crates that remained were not in the chamber but in the creek below, paper like lilies in a flood, pulp like bread. A document clung to a stone and offered her a smudged paragraph about payments disguised as timber rights. Another wore the judge's name like a burden it wanted to hand off. Field squatted and pried the ledgers he'd left inside the mountain out of the wet straw nests he had made for them in the dark the night before. "Good thinking," Katrin said, meaning it. "Good memory," he returned. "You told me the mountain keeps secrets if you ask." They gathered what could be salvaged. They buried the crates that had become too much like carcass. They cut the firing wire again, in case anger had reconnected it in their absence. They stood at the mouth and breathed the cold that comes from deep places and means the world still has an inside. "Will they take it all back?" Jory asked. "Make it nothing?" "They'll try," Katrin said. "They'll buy ink where they can't buy people. They'll say those we named misremembered. They'll put a priest in a headline so God looks like their lawyer. Some will believe them. Enough won't." She looked east, where the pass cut a bright V into the sky. "One thing men like that don't understand, once a truth has tasted air, it doesn't go back underground." They turned their horses toward town as rain softened from sermon to lullaby. On the way down, they met wagons coming up, farmers with shovels and gunny sacks, miners with wet coats and rope, drawn by a curiosity that wasn't about gold for once. Katrin told them what they needed to hear and let them find the rest with their own eyes. She didn't hoard the story. The story wasn't hers to hoard. In town, the telegraph office had become a stove around which editors warmed their hands. Replies coughed in from cities whose names looked like foreign words next to their own. Denver, printing. Salt Lake, send more. Cheyenne, governor has questions. The governor was a man who answered whichever question cheered the crowd most, but questions aimed at the right wall can turn into nails. Pritchard attempted an injunction. Mavis printed it with a headline that read "Judge orders silence, Valley says no." The sheriff refused to enforce the injunction on the grounds that his legs had a different errand. Pinkertons lingered like flies that refused to quit a wound. Silkwire was a rumor moving always a day ahead. That evening, Field stopped by the Morell place with a sack of nails and a look that said he'd learned to ask before hammering them. Katrin had her sleeves rolled and the ledger open on the table. She'd been writing names on a clean sheet, living ones. People who would sign a statement. People who would stand on steps with the boy and say, "Yes, I said that, yes, I saw it." "You going to leave this town when they indict you?" he asked. "They'll indict me," she said. "I'll still be here." He set the sack down. "You could go. Ridge Trail to the north is clear. I could get you up and over before morning." "You could," she agreed. "And then where would the ledgers be?" "With me," he said. "Or with Mavis. Or with a dozen editors in a dozen cities." "And the boy?" she asked softly. "And the sheriff?" "And wives who learned to be husbands because water took what it wanted. Men like Silkwire are counting on me to run. They hired engines and courts in fear expecting I'd have the good sense to be small. I haven't been good at small since I was 12. He watched her for a long time. "You remind me of the mountain," he said at last. "Pretty," she teased, "because lightness is a tool if you use it right." "Patient," he said. "And you don't move because someone tells you the map changed." They sat on the porch steps because the room was too full of ink and plans for talk. Rain turned gutters into sentences you could read by ear. Proverb nibbled the ragwort along the fence and occasionally pretended to be startled by thunder to make Katrin laugh. She did, once, then more honestly the second time. "Why'd you hire on with him?" she asked, meaning Silkwire. Field rubbed his thumb along the nail sack's hem. "Men like me don't get hired by piano teachers. Work comes on wagons and in envelopes with secrets stuck to the flaps. I told myself I was hauling crates, not ruining lives. Men get good at telling themselves stories that let them sleep." He looked at her. "You came along and told a worse story. I haven't slept since." "That's a compliment." "It is," she said, and leaned her shoulder into his for the length of one quiet breath. I'm sorry it has to be. Sorry is for men who burn dams, he said. I'll take tired. Night put its hand on the valley and discovered it couldn't hush it. Lanterns burned at the courthouse, at the press, at the depot, at houses that had forgotten their lamps were for more than supper. Somewhere, a fiddle tried a song and tripped on its own hope, then found a beat and made it right. Near midnight, a rider came hard from the west. His horse foamed the way bad news foams. He slid out of the saddle on the run and stumbled up Katrin's walk. From the pass, he panted. Company men, 20, maybe more, coming from the Ghost Notch. They brought a wagon with a pump on it and barrels. Not water. Oil, Field said. He stood up in a single line. Katrin closed the ledger. She did not take it. She took instead the whistle and the cartridge roll and the knowledge that the second part of the night would be about keeping what they had bought the first part with sweat. They met the company men at the edge of town where willow shadows brayed with cottonwood roots. The moon had decided to put a shoulder in. It spilled just enough light to make a lie of darkness. Silkwire rode in the front wagon with the confidence of a man whose lawyers have taught him that everything is a contract, even murder if you call it enforcement. The pump on the rear wagon had brass bright enough to lecture by. Barrels sloshed. The smell carried far. You could feel it on your teeth. The sheriff stepped into the road with his badge pinned under his jaw instead of on his vest because he had decided tonight he would speak with his mouth, not with tin. Turn around, he said. There's rain on the ridge. There's a town awake. There's a printing press you can't fit in a barrel. We're here to control a riot, Silkwire said. My men will secure your square, your press, and your cooperation. Your men will pass through me first, the sheriff said, and his voice carried the particular music of a man who has already paid for his courage and won't be overcharged. Mavis, standing on a dry goods crate because altitude helps, raised a hand. Friends, she called to the town behind them. Don't give them what they came for. They came for a fight they can photograph and file. Give them buckets. Give them witnesses. Give them truth. The crowd answered with the sound 1,000 bodies make when they choose to be one thing instead of 1,000 things. Silkwire's face didn't change. Advance, he said. They did, boots biting mud, eyes holding the distance between order and harm. Field moved along the flank like a man herding cattle out of a thorn thicket. He didn't touch anyone. He didn't need to. The kind of calm he carried is contagious the way fever is. A barrel on the back wagon shifted. The road went a little off camber there, everyone knew it, no one remembered in time. The iron hoop caught the wagon bed's lip and with a slow inevitability that felt like history, the barrel rolled. It hit the ground and burst its bung and vomited its glossy soul into the street. Katrin didn't think. She blew the short, sharp whistle once, break, and twice, brace, and in the heartbeat that followed, the bucket line formed as if the room they'd practiced in had always been this road. Water hit oil. Oil spread then surrendered to grit. The barrel's second exhalation met a shovel in a ditch that had been dug last spring to keep the store dry, and followed it meekly away from doors and lanterns. Silkwire's glove creaked. Light it, he said softly, and that was when Field stepped into the wagon's rear and put his hand on the pump handle as if the handle were a wrist he could still turn toward home. No, he said. He didn't say it like a challenge. He said it like a man introducing a truth to a room that had been using the wrong word. A Pinkerton swung a baton and caught Field across the forearm. The sound was a dull apple crack. Field's face didn't move. He didn't let go. Two miners closed on the agent like jaws and removed the baton from his story. They didn't return it. Katrin stepped into the gap where fear wanted to live and filled it with her voice. Look at your hands, she shouted to the company men. Look at what you're holding. It's not law. It's not order. It's a match. When your children ask you what you did tonight, will you tell them you lit a town because a man in a good hat told you to? One of the younger men looked down. He was Jory with a few extra winters. His hand shook a little. He lowered the torch a degree that mattered. Rain, well-mannered and late, decided to join. It came in with the soft authority of a woman who knows everyone's name. It made torches sulk and wicks argue with themselves. It put a sheen on Silkwire's hat that he couldn't brush off without admitting whether happens to him, too. "Retreat," he said, so soft only men trained to hear him could hear it. They didn't at first. Retreat isn't a word men in paid coats like. But they felt the town under their boots and the rain on their wrists and the way shame works when a boy with ink on his fingers looks at you without blinking. They took one step back. Then another. Then a horse turned of its own accord because horses are honest faster than men, and that moved the whole road. Silkwire's cane ticked time across the planks of the bridge as he left. He did not look back. Men like him have never learned how. The wagons creaked into the dark and took their barrels with them. The town let out a breath it had put on layaway at dusk. The next morning, the governor's man came with a mustache like a promise and a letter with words that can mean anything if you tilt them. He shook Katrin's hand and told her she was under indictment, and also that a commission had been formed, and also that men in larger rooms had taken sudden interest in dams. He spoke so carefully he almost didn't speak at all. "Welcome to the fight," Mavis told him sweetly, and handed him 10 copies of the broadside. "Take those to your larger rooms." They did indict Katrin. They also, 2 days later, indicted Pritchard. The sheriff escorted the judge to the jail with a politeness that reduced gossip to ash. Field testified in a shirt with his sleeves rolled past the bruise. Jory stood on those church steps again and read a letter from a widow who couldn't bear to come herself because the courthouse smelled too much like the room she had washed her husband's body in. A month later, an engineer from the state walked the old dam site with Katrin and asked her questions like a man who had decided to learn the names of things before he decided what to do with them. He listened. When a man like that listens, the river changes its tone. Silkwire sent letters through men whose job was to be envelopes. He offered money. He offered safety. He offered correction. When none of that worked, he offered fear again with machine edges. It still didn't take. Fear had had a long run in the valley. It was tired. By Snow's first threat, a new dam plan lay on a table with walls around it that were glass, not wood. People could see through. People could ask. People could be wrong out loud and then be right together. The railroad found that flour still moved when you didn't spill blood under it. Timber went out. Roofs went up. The valley learned how to be a river without forgetting it was also a place men live. On a morning so clean it hurt to stand in, Katrin rode with Field back up to the mine. The shelf had gone to seed, the crumholes still twisted like dancers arrested mid-spite. Snow had caught in the shadows and decided to stay the day. They dismounted and stood before the mouth with its black canvas lip. "Make a church of it?" Field asked. He meant, sanctify it by not going in again. "Make a school," Katrin said. "Where boys learn to read ledgers and girls learn to read horizons." He smiled. "You'll run it?" "I'll run cattle," she said. "And the newspaper will run your school. And the sheriff will stand in the door on rainy days. And when the boys get itchy we'll teach them to be itchy at the right things." They laughed. It surprised crows from a nearby spruce and sent them up in a black fluster that looked like punctuation. Proverb tossed her mane and pretended to shy at the birds because she did not like to be left out of jokes. Field sobered first. "He'll come back," he said, "not to spoil the day but to keep it true. Men like him don't put down canes easily." "So will we," Katrin said. Every morning. They stood there until their toes told them snow was beautiful and also mean. Then they rode down to a valley that was learning its own name, one broadside, one bucket, one boy's voice at a time. That night, after supper, Katrin sat on her porch and wrote a letter in the ledger's blank back pages, not to a judge, not to an editor, but to her father. She told him what she had learned the way you tell an old friend a story he almost knows already. She told him about the mountain and the way it hides and reveals, about engines and buckets and boys who become men in the space between 2 paragraphs. She told him about a man who had been hired to haul crates of other men's sins and decided instead to haul truth down the grade. She told him about ink and rain and the way both feel like hope when they touch your skin. When she finished, she closed the book and set it on the table and listened to the river's winter voice. It sounded like an old fiddle in a warm room. Someone down the street was trying the tune again and making it better. Someone at the press was oiling the bearings and wiping the letters clean. Someone at the jail was snoring. Someone at the church was sweeping steps because the boy liked to read without dust at his feet. Katrin leaned back and let the chair tilt halfway to danger and then stop exactly where it needed to. She had work in the morning and after that and the morning after that, for as far ahead as she could see. Work didn't scare her. Work was the shape of her name. She lifted the whistle and blew a single, sweet note that would have called Asa Morel back from the far shore if God had debt to pay. It drifted up into the winter stars and found their cold edges and didn't mind them. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.